What happens when an innocent child's pride is shattered by the very teacher meant to inspire him? In a sunny third-grade classroom in Chandler, Arizona, 8-year-old Malik Johnson proudly declares that his father works for NASA. But instead of praise, his white teacher, Mr. Denton, laughs, in front of the whole class. The sting of that dismissive chuckle silences Malik, crushing not only his excitement, but the belief that someone like him could dare to dream big. What Mr. Denton doesn't know is that Malik's father, Dr. Terrence Johnson, is a real aerospace engineer working on a Mars relay project, and he's about to walk through the classroom door wearing a NASA badge that will flip everything upside down. From torn-up drawings to a moment of quiet redemption, this story dives deep into how racial bias can steal a child's voice, and how truth, spoken boldly, can restore it. Stick around to see how one father's presence rewrites the story, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. It was the kind of morning Malik Johnson had been waiting for all week. The classroom buzzed with energy at Prescott Elementary. Third graders shifted in their seats, their backpacks slouched at the backs of tiny chairs. It was career week, a beloved tradition where parents visited the classroom to talk about their jobs, and kids got to sit on the alphabet rug, wide-eyed and proud, as they shared what their moms and dads did for a living. For most of the students, it was a fun break from the monotony of spelling quizzes and math drills. But for Malik, it was more than that. He had been practicing in front of the mirror every morning, rehearsing how he would say it, "My dad works at NASA." He'd even drawn a picture of his dad holding Earth in one hand and a satellite in the other. It was folded carefully in his backpack like treasure. Malik was smaller than most of the kids in class, wiry, with bright eyes that lit up when he talked about space. He loved words like orbit and relay. He drank Capri Sun while watching space documentaries with his dad in the garage and asked questions every 2 minutes. This wasn't just admiration. This was legacy. That morning, Mr. Denton, their teacher, early 40s, receding hairline, a tucked-in polo with the school logo, stood at the front of the room holding a clipboard. "All right, class," he said. "Let's start by sharing what your parents do. Then we'll have our visitors speak this afternoon." Kids perked up, their hands shooting into the air. One by one, they spoke with pride. "My mom's a nurse. My dad's a mechanic. My grandma owns a bakery." When it was Malik's turn, he sat up straighter than usual. His voice was confident. "My dad works at NASA," he said, chest puffed out. A brief silence followed, not the kind of silence that waits for more detail, but the kind that drips with disbelief. Then came a snort. A boy in the back muttered, "Yeah, right." But it was Mr. Denton's reaction that cut the deepest. He let out a chuckle, not loud, not obvious, but unmistakably dismissive. The kind of laugh that adults sometimes use when they think a kid is making something up. "NASA, huh?" Mr. Denton raised an eyebrow. "That's quite the imagination, Malik. Maybe next time, we aim for something a little more realistic, okay?" A few kids giggled. One girl repeated it under her breath, "More realistic," like it was a private joke only the class shared. Malik stared down at the carpet. His hands, which had been animated just moments before, curled into fists on his lap. He didn't respond. He didn't correct anyone. His gaze locked on a tiny piece of lint embedded in the rug, as if it were the only thing anchoring him in place. The teacher moved on. He didn't pause to see the way Malik's body seemed to shrink, or how the light in his eyes dimmed just a little. But someone did. Mila, the girl who sat beside Malik, leaned in and whispered softly, "I believe you." He didn't look up. He just nodded slightly. The morning dragged on. Jacob's dad, the firefighter, came in with his helmet. Chloe's mom brought cookies shaped like business cards. Kids clapped and laughed. Malik just sat there. At lunch, he didn't touch his sandwich. He didn't chase his friends to the swings. He didn't laugh when someone did cartwheels by the vending machine. All he could think about was the laugh. Not just the words, not even the doubt, but the ease of it. How casually Mr. Denton had dismissed him. How quickly a grown man, someone who was supposed to lift him up, had clipped his wings. That night, at home, Malik didn't say much during dinner. His dad, Dr. Terence Johnson, noticed. He was an aerospace engineer, but at the dinner table, he was just Dad, gentle, calm, always ready to explain things in a way that made Malik feel like the smartest kid in the galaxy. After dinner, Malik finally said it. Today at school. I told them you work for NASA. Terence looked up from his tea. And? My teacher laughed. There was a long pause. Terence didn't rush to respond. He set down his mug, leaned forward. Did you laugh? Malik shook his head. No. Did you lie? No. Then you did nothing wrong. But what if they don't believe me? Then that's their problem, not yours. But what if they laugh again? Terence's face softened. He knew what the world could be like. Especially for boys who looked like Malik. If they laugh, you keep your head up, he said. The truth doesn't need applause. It just needs to be said. Malik nodded slowly. He didn't fully understand it, but it settled into his chest like something solid. That night, Malik stayed up a little later than usual. He opened his backpack, smoothed out the wrinkled picture he had drawn of his dad, and added stars around it. Then he rehearsed his speech one more time in the mirror, pointing like his dad did when he explained complicated things. The next day came with dread. Malik had meant to walk into class with pride, ready to show the world who his dad really was. But the day before had taken something out of him. He sat at his desk quietly, chewing the inside of his cheek. At one point, he ripped the drawing in half and stuffed it into the bottom of his bag. As the clock ticked toward the final hour of school, Malik's knee bounced. Career presentations were about to begin. Parents were lining up outside. One by one, they came in. The mechanic. The baker. The accountant. Still, no sign of his dad. Malik's stomach twisted. What if he got stuck in traffic? What if he had a meeting? What if Mr. Denton was right? He was so lost in his thoughts he didn't notice the door open. But Mr. Denton did. He stopped mid-sentence, eyes fixed on the man entering the room. Dr. Terence Johnson walked in with calm confidence. Navy blue blazer. Crisp white shirt. A NASA badge clipped just below the pocket. He didn't need a hard hat or a tray of cookies. His presence alone commanded attention. Good afternoon, he said, his voice smooth and steady. I'm Dr. Johnson. I design spacecraft. The room froze. Every child turned. Mr. Denton blinked. Malik sat up so quickly his chair scraped the floor. He didn't smile, yet. But something lit behind his eyes. Dr. Johnson clicked a button on the screen. A photo of satellites orbiting Mars appeared. These, he said, are part of the relay system that lets spacecraft communicate with Earth. Like space phones? One kid asked. Terence grinned. Exactly. But with really bad reception. The room burst into laughter. Even Malik chuckled. He hadn't laughed like that in 2 days. Dr. Johnson explained his work with clarity and patience, never once addressing the elephant in the room, never pointing fingers or raising his voice. But before he wrapped up, he paused. I heard someone say working at NASA might be unrealistic, he said, turning to Malik. I guess it depends on your definition of realistic. Mr. Denton stood off to the side, quiet, clutching his clipboard like a life raft. After Dr. Johnson left, Mr. Denton tried to regain control of the room. But the tone had shifted. The kids weren't looking at him. They were looking at Malik. And Malik? He sat with his head held high, not smug, not vengeful. Just proud. When the class ended and the students packed up, Mr. Denton lingered at Malik's desk. "Hey," he said awkwardly, "your dad's impressive." Malik didn't respond. "I may have jumped the gun yesterday," Mr. Denton added. Malik looked up. "You laughed." "I did," the teacher admitted. "And I'm sorry. I should have listened." Malik didn't nod. Didn't say thank you. Just stood, backpack slung over one shoulder. "It wasn't my imagination," he said softly. "That's really my dad." And with that, he walked out. That night, as the Arizona sky turned orange and pink, Malik sat at the kitchen table eating cereal for dinner, his choice. His dad leaned against the counter with a mug that read, "Space Nerd." "Did you hear him?" Malik asked suddenly. Terrence raised an eyebrow. "Your teacher. When I said you worked at NASA." Terrence nodded. "I heard. Why do people laugh when they don't believe you?" "Because some people live in small boxes," Terrence said. "And anything outside that box scares them." "But it still hurt." "I know," Terrence said. "But don't ever let someone's doubt erase your truth." The next day at school, the same kids who had laughed now wanted to sit near Malik. One even asked if his dad knew any astronauts. Malik didn't brag. He didn't need to. That afternoon, he found a folded note in his cubby. "Malik. I was wrong. You shouldn't have had to prove anything to us. Keep dreaming big. Mr. Denton." Malik read it once, folded it again, and tucked it quietly into his backpack. He didn't need the apology. But maybe Mr. Denton needed to write it. And Malik? He walked out of school with his head high, not because others finally believed him, but because he had never stopped believing in himself. The day after the NASA presentation, the halls of Prescott Elementary felt different. It wasn't something you could see, exactly, no decorations, no announcements, but the air felt charged, like a storm had passed through and left the sky a little clearer. Malik Johnson walked through those halls with a quiet confidence, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders, his sneakers squeaking against the linoleum with every step. No longer did kids glance past him like he was invisible. They looked at him now. Some of them even smiled. Mila was waiting by the lockers when Malik arrived. She handed him a red pencil she'd sharpened just for him. "In case you feel like drawing more satellites," she said, grinning. He smiled back, a real one this time. "Thanks." In class, Mr. Denton was noticeably different. He greeted the students with a tighter-than-usual smile, his usual booming voice now toned down a notch. He called roll with extra care, as if enunciating names could somehow erase yesterday's sting. When he got to Malik's name, he paused just slightly. "Malik Johnson." "Here," Malik said, calm and even. There was no follow-up comment. No chuckle. Just a nod from Mr. Denton before he moved on. But even that silence said something. During morning work time, kids began to whisper, not with mockery, but with curiosity. "Does your dad get to see rockets up close? Is he, like, famous? Can you FaceTime him from space?" Malik kept his answers simple. "He works on communication systems. He doesn't fly the rockets, but he helps them talk to Earth." That explanation alone seemed to enchant them. One boy even asked if Malik could bring a space phone to school one day. Mila leaned over during writing time. "They believe you now." Malik shrugged. "They didn't have to." "Still nice, though," she said. In the staff lounge, Mr. Denton sat alone at one of the circular tables near the window. He stirred his coffee for too long, letting the spoon clink against the sides like a metronome. The other teachers came and went, chatting about lesson plans and recess duty. He didn't speak to anyone. When the lunch bell rang, Mr. Denton quietly folded a sheet of lined paper, creased it with care, and slipped it into the J section of the student cubbies. He didn't type it, didn't sign it with a flourish, just a simple note, handwritten, folded twice. Malik found it after lunch. It read, "Malik, I was wrong. You shouldn't have had to prove anything to us. Keep dreaming big. Mr. Denton." Malik didn't smile. He didn't read it twice. He folded it, slipped it into the front pocket of his backpack, and zipped it closed. It wasn't that the note didn't matter. It was just unnecessary. Not for him, maybe, but for Mr. Denton, who clearly needed to write it. After school, Malik walked to the pickup area with a slower pace than usual. Not dragging his feet, but absorbing. Listening. Thinking. He noticed how other kids were talking differently to one another, asking deeper questions, even about things like space or science. Something had shifted. And while he didn't think that shift was permanent, he knew it mattered. That evening, back home, the house was quiet except for the low hum of a dishwasher. Terence Johnson sat at the kitchen table surrounded by printed diagrams and technical schematics, red ink circling satellite coordinates. Malik, perched on the couch, flipped through a library book on Mars exploration. "Dad," he said suddenly, "what does it feel like when someone doubts you, and they're supposed to believe in you?" Terence looked up. "You mean like a teacher?" Malik nodded. Terence leaned back in his chair. "It's hard. Because you grow up thinking certain people are supposed to lift you up. And when they don't, when they tear you down instead, it feels personal." It was personal. "I know," Terence said. "But here's what matters, you didn't let it shrink you. You still told the truth." Malik ran his thumb along the edge of the Mars photo in his book. "Sometimes I wanted to lie and just say you were a janitor or something. That way no one would laugh." Terence's face shifted, not in anger, but in quiet heartbreak. "You never have to downplay the truth to make others comfortable," he said. "Especially when your truth is something to be proud of." Malik nodded slowly. Then he said something that surprised even himself. "I didn't feel proud at first. I felt small." Terence got up, walked over, and sat beside him on the couch. "That's what people like Denton don't understand," he said softly. "One dismissive comment can echo in a kid's mind for years. It doesn't just make you feel small, it makes you question if you were ever allowed to feel big." Malik looked up at his father. "But I'm still allowed to feel big, right?" Terence placed a hand on his shoulder. "Always." The next few days at school passed like a slow shift in weather. Not everything changed. Some kids went back to their old jokes. A few still whispered. But it was different now. Because Malik knew the truth. And he wasn't alone anymore. One afternoon, Mr. Denton pulled him aside during independent reading time. His voice was quiet, almost strained. "I just wanted to say thank you for letting your dad come in. I learned something, too." Malik tilted his head. "You mean about satellites?" Mr. Denton smiled, embarrassed. "Not just that." Malik didn't press. He just nodded once and returned to his seat. The following week, during the final day of Career Week, Principal Lopez visited the classroom to thank the students and parents who had participated. She mentioned how inspiring it had been to see the range of professions, from bakers to mechanics to engineers. "And to see such diversity in our role models," she added, her eyes briefly landing on Malik. Mr. Denton cleared his throat but said nothing. Later, while packing up, Mila whispered, "You think he's gonna change?" Malik shrugged. "Maybe. I just hope next time a kid says something big, he listens." As the students filed out, Mr. Denton once again stood near the cubbies, watching them go. When Malik walked past, he gave him a slight nod, subtle, but sincere. And Malik, still not smiling, nodded back. That weekend, Terence and Malik visited the Science Museum downtown. In one of the exhibits, a touchscreen showed a 3D model of the Mars rover communication systems, something Terence had actually worked on. Malik pressed the screen, watching the animation light up. A small plaque beneath the display read, "Behind every mission is a team of engineers, mathematicians, and dreamers who make communication across planets possible." Terence pointed to it. "That's what I meant the other night," he said. "We all make each other possible." Malik stared at the plaque, then up at his dad. "You think I could work at NASA one day?" Terence didn't hesitate. "I don't think it. I know it." That night, as Malik lay in bed, he reached into his backpack and pulled out the folded drawing, the one he had torn up, then taped back together in secret. The creases were visible, and a corner was missing, but it was still whole. He placed it on the wall above his desk. Not because he needed anyone else to see it, but because he did. Because sometimes, even when the world laughs, you hang on to what's real. And truth, when spoken by someone brave enough, has a way of echoing louder than doubt ever could. Monday morning came with a different kind of energy. Malik woke up before his alarm, already dressed by the time the smell of scrambled eggs drifted from the kitchen. His father, Terence, was at the stove in his usual NASA hoodie and sweatpants, humming a Marvin Gaye tune under his breath. "You're up early," Terence said, flipping eggs onto a plate. "I'm not tired," Malik replied, taking his seat at the kitchen table. "I kinda wanna get to school early." Terence raised an eyebrow. "That a first?" Malik gave a quiet smile. "I don't know. Things just feel better now." Terence slid the plate across the table and sat down across from him, coffee steaming in his mug. "You walking in proud today?" Malik nodded. "Yeah. But not because of the others. Because I'm still me." Terence tapped the edge of his mug. "That's the only reason you'll ever need." As they drove to school, Malik stared out the window, watching the familiar streets roll by. The gas station on the corner. The barbershop with the rotating red and white pole. The bookstore with faded "Back to School" posters still hanging in the window. Everything looked the same. But inside him, something had shifted. He wasn't walking in today just to be seen, he was walking in already knowing who he was. At school, the buzz from Career Week hadn't completely died down. There were still whispers about Malik's dad. A few kids even asked if he could come back to talk again. But it wasn't the awe in their voices that stood out to Malik now, it was the curiosity. They actually wanted to know more. In reading group that morning, Mr. Denton selected a passage about inventors and engineers. He didn't call on Malik, but he looked at him several times, like silently asking permission to move forward. Afterward, Malik stayed behind to help Mila shelve books in the classroom library. "You still got that drawing of your dad?" she asked. "Yeah. I taped it back together." "You gonna show it?" Malik shook his head. "Don't need to. I just wanted to keep it." Mila nodded. "I like that." That afternoon, during free writing, Mr. Denton gave the class an open prompt: write about someone who inspires you. Malik sat still for a moment, pencil tapping rhythmically against the desk. He thought about writing about his dad, about satellites and relay systems and dusty red Martian landscapes. But instead, he wrote something simpler. More personal. "The truth doesn't need to be loud to matter," he scribbled. "Sometimes it just needs to be said, even if no one claps." When Mr. Denton collected the papers, he lingered over Malik's desk for half a second longer than usual. "Thanks," he said. "Not just for the paper. For something more." At home that night, Malik brought his journal to the dinner table. It was a tradition they'd started when he was 6, writing down one interesting thing each day. Sometimes it was a fun fact from school. Other times, just something that made him feel good or curious or proud. Today, he wrote, "I told the truth and it didn't need fixing." Terence read it upside down and smiled. "Solid," he said, taking a bite of chicken. "You ever think about being a writer?" Malik grinned. "Only if NASA doesn't work out." The next morning, something unusual happened. Principal Lopez called Malik to the office during science class. The classroom murmured with curiosity as he stepped out, backpack still slung over one shoulder. He couldn't imagine what it was. He hadn't done anything wrong. His mind raced. Was there a problem? Did something happen to Dad? But when he walked into the front office, he saw a familiar figure standing beside the principal's desk. Dr. Terrence Johnson. Dad? Terrence smiled. Surprise. Principal Lopez stood with a hand on her hip. We're having a small district event here today. A few local leaders and educators are visiting. I asked Dr. Johnson if he'd be willing to speak briefly, to represent both our school's community and the impact of parental involvement. Malik's eyes widened. Wait, you're giving another speech? Terrence looked at him and shrugged. Nothing too long. I figured if I survived a room full of third graders, I can handle a few adults. Malik couldn't help but smile. Principal Lopez leaned in. I also wanted to ask, would you like to say something too? Just a short introduction for your dad. Nothing fancy. Malik blinked. Me? You don't have to. But I thought, after last week, it might be powerful. Terrence nodded. Only if you want to. Malik looked down at his sneakers. Then up at the principal. I'll do it. An hour later, he stood in front of a room of unfamiliar faces, school board members, community leaders, a few teachers from other schools. Mr. Denton was there too, sitting toward the back, hands folded tightly in his lap. Malik stepped up to the mic. He didn't have a paper. Just his voice. Hi, he began, hands shaking just slightly. My name is Malik Johnson. I'm in third grade here at Prescott. And, my dad works for NASA. A pause. He helps rockets talk to Earth. He doesn't fly them, but he makes sure they don't get lost. And, he taught me that the truth doesn't need to be big to matter. It just needs to be true. The room was still. Then came soft clapping. Then louder. Then Terrence walked up beside him, placed a hand gently on Malik's shoulder, and started his own remarks. It wasn't a long speech. It didn't need to be. He talked about the importance of showing up for kids. About how dreams grow in spaces where they're heard and believed. About how adults have a responsibility to protect imagination, not diminish it. When he was done, the room stood to applaud. Malik didn't glow. He didn't grin. He just stood there, quietly proud. Afterward, Mr. Denton approached the two of them near the refreshment table. I just wanted to say, thank you, he said awkwardly. Both of you. Terrence nodded politely. Malik looked him in the eyes. I'm glad you listened this time. Mr. Denton blinked. Me too. Later that evening, back at home, Malik added a new entry to his journal. Today I told the truth out loud and people listened. Not because I was loud. But because they were finally ready to hear it. Terrence read over his shoulder. That one's a keeper. Malik grinned. You think they'll stay ready? Terrence paused, then answered honestly. Some will. Some won't. But you will. And that's what matters. That night, Malik slept with the drawing above his desk glowing faintly in the light of a night lamp. And somewhere in the quiet space between sleep and dreams, he saw himself, not just as a boy in a classroom, but as a future engineer, holding the plans for a spacecraft of his own. The kind that doesn't just reach planets, but carries voices with it. The weekend after the district event, Malik Johnson found himself waking up earlier than usual, not because of nerves or an alarm, but because something inside him buzzed with quiet determination. He sat at his desk before the sun had fully risen, sketching with a pencil that had been worn down to a stub. On the paper was the early draft of an idea, a spacecraft that could travel far beyond Mars, equipped with a new kind of communication system that wouldn't just send data, but voices. Real voices. Stories. Truths. He wasn't sure it could work. But he was sure he wanted to try. Downstairs, Terence was already in the kitchen, toasting bagels and skimming a NASA conference schedule on his tablet. When Malik came in, hair messy and eyes still squinting from sleep, Terence looked up and smiled. "You're up early for a Saturday." "I've got work," Malik said seriously, placing his sketchbook on the table like it was a mission report. Terence flipped the tablet over and leaned in. "What are we looking at?" Malik opened the sketch. "A ship that doesn't just carry astronauts, it carries their stories. Voices from Earth. Like, if a kid says something important, it gets saved. Even if nobody listens at first." Terence studied the page, then looked at his son. "You're designing a spacecraft to make sure the truth never gets lost." Malik nodded. "I guess I am." Terence leaned back. "That's the kind of engineering that actually changes things." Later that afternoon, while most kids were glued to cartoons or video games, Malik was at the local library. He had a notebook under his arm and a determined look in his eyes. With permission from the librarian, he sat up in the corner with a stack of books on deep space communication systems. A few high schoolers looked at him curiously, but none said a word. Malik was in his element. When Mila arrived to meet him, having promised to help him figure out the drawing software on the library's old desktop computers, she looked over his notebook, eyebrows raised. "Whoa! You drew all of this?" "Yeah," Malik said. "It's not perfect. But I want to make a better version." Mila nodded. "You're gonna need color." They spent the next hour scanning pages, adjusting fonts, playing with layout options, and trying not to let the ancient printer jam for the third time in a row. By the time they finished, Malik held a color-printed diagram of his voice ship design, complete with labeled systems, notes in the margins, and a title across the top. "The Truth Voyager." He didn't say anything dramatic when he looked at it. He just stared at the page for a long while, then folded it with care and slid it into his backpack. It felt like something he would need to carry with him, not just that day, but maybe for years. At school on Monday, Mr. Denton had returned to his usual demeanor, structured, polite, focused, but different in subtle ways. He paused more when students spoke. Asked follow-up questions. Listened. During morning meeting, he said something he'd never said before. "This week," he announced, "we're starting something new. I want each of you to pick one word that matters to you. Write it on a note card, decorate it however you like, and we'll hang them on the wall. Think of it as your power word. A reminder of what you stand for." Malik knew his word immediately. Voice. By recess, a rainbow of note cards lined the classroom wall. Some said, friendship. Others said, math, or kindness. Mila's said, stand. Malik's, written in bold block letters with tiny stars dotting the background, said, voice. Mr. Denton read each one as students lined up. When he got to Malik's, he paused, then said quietly, "That's a good word." Malik simply nodded. Later that week, the school counselor, Ms. Rayner, invited Malik to speak during the Friday assembly. She had heard about his brief speech at the district event and thought it could inspire the other students. Malik hesitated. The idea of standing in front of the entire school, hundreds of kids, teachers, even the janitor who always played oldies from his cart, made his stomach twist. But Terence said something that changed his mind. Every time you speak the truth, you're making the world just a little bit easier for the next kid who needs to do the same. So Malik said yes. Friday came. He wore his cleanest hoodie, jeans with no holes, and the sneakers Terence had gotten him for his birthday. In his pocket was a folded piece of paper, but he didn't plan to use it. He just needed to know it was there. When Principal Lopez introduced him, she kept it short. One of our own has reminded us that even the quietest voices can say the most important things. Please welcome Malik Johnson. The gym was packed. Folding chairs squeaked. Kids whispered. Malik stepped up to the mic. My name is Malik, he began. I used to think being small meant I had to stay quiet. But I learned something this year. I learned that truth doesn't care how old you are, or how tall. It just needs someone who won't let it disappear. He glanced at Mr. Denton, who stood near the wall, arms folded, eyes locked on Malik. I told the truth about my dad. Some people didn't believe me. Some even laughed. But the truth doesn't change just because people doubt it. That's something my dad taught me. He paused. So now I try to tell the truth out loud. Even when it's scary. Even when I think nobody's listening. Because one day, someone might need to hear it. And with that, he stepped back. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the clapping. And then the cheering. Back in the classroom, after the assembly, Mr. Denton pulled Malik aside. I've been teaching for 18 years, he said. But I learned more in the past 2 weeks than in any of those years before. Malik tilted his head. Why? Because I forgot that believing in a student's voice is just as important as teaching them how to use it. He reached into his desk and handed Malik a small envelope. Inside was a printed certificate that read, Prescott Elementary Truth Teller Award. Presented to Malik Johnson. For speaking with courage, clarity, and conviction. Malik looked at it for a long moment, then tucked it into his folder alongside the Truth Voyager blueprint. That afternoon, as the school day ended, Malik waited for Terence outside near the big oak tree in front of the building. When his dad pulled up, Malik hopped in and said, Can we stop by the bookstore? Terence raised an eyebrow. Sure. What for? I want to get one of those composition notebooks. The ones scientists use in the movies. What for? Malik looked out the window. I think I've got more things to say. Terence smiled. Let's go fill a few pages. And so they did. Because truth, once it's been spoken out loud, doesn't just sit still, it echoes, it travels, it finds new shapes. And Malik Johnson, with his sharpened pencil, steady hands, and NASA in his blood, was just getting started. Spring came early to Chandler, Arizona. By the time March rolled around, the desert sun had already begun warming the sidewalks by mid-morning, and the schoolyard at Prescott Elementary buzzed with restless energy. Kids tossed basketballs, chalked hopscotch lines, and counted the days until spring break. But Malik Johnson wasn't thinking about sunshine or vacation. He was thinking about a question that had been following him around for weeks. What would have happened if his dad hadn't shown up? It was a question that made him pause sometimes, in the middle of a math problem, or during a quiet moment at lunch. What if Mr. Denton's laughter had been the final word? What if nobody had ever believed him? The applause, the truth teller certificate, the district presentation, all of it hinged on one thing, his father walking through that classroom door with a NASA badge and the quiet weight of undeniable truth. And what about the kids whose truth didn't arrive in time? That question stuck. So did the memory of Mila whispering, I believe you, before she even had proof. On a Thursday afternoon, while Malik was organizing his materials for a science fair project, he found himself staring at the words he'd written on his display board. Voice, how ideas travel through space. At first, it was just going to be a basic project about sound waves and radio frequencies. But now, it was becoming something more. He didn't just want to explain the science of communication, he wanted to explore who gets heard, and who doesn't. Dad, he asked over dinner that night, have you ever been in a room where people didn't believe you, just because of how you looked? Terence paused, setting down his fork. Yeah, he said. More than once. What did you do? I told the truth anyway. Not because they deserved it, but because I did. Malik nodded slowly. That ever get easier? Terence thought for a moment. You get stronger. That helps. The next day, Malik asked Ms. Rayner, the school counselor, if he could start a lunchtime group for kids to talk about stuff like that. Not just science or homework, but the times they felt like their voices didn't matter. She was surprised, but immediately supportive. "What would you call it?" she asked. Malik didn't hesitate. "Voyagers." So every Tuesday and Thursday at lunch, a few students gathered in the library. Mila helped organize the sign-up sheet and brought cookies from her grandma's bakery. Some days it was just 4 or 5 kids. Other times, nearly 20 showed up. The rules were simple: listen, share, respect. Some talked about being teased for the way they talked or dressed. Others mentioned being ignored in class or feeling invisible when they raised their hands. A 5th grader named Aisha talked about being the only girl who liked building robots, and how other kids said that made her weird. Malik never preached. He just listened. And when it was time, he shared his story, too, not the version with the applause, but the one with the torn-up drawing and the crushed feeling after Mr. Denton's laugh. That version mattered more. By April, word of the Voyagers group had reached the district office. A coordinator emailed Principal Lopez asking if Malik would be willing to speak again, this time at a district-wide student forum on student voice and equity. When Ms. Rayner told him, Malik didn't say yes right away. He went home, took out his notebook, and wrote one sentence. "This can't just be about me." He showed the note to Terence. "Then bring someone with you," his father said. Malik nodded. He knew exactly who. At the forum, Malik took the stage with Mila and Aisha by his side. The room was filled with students from across the city, middle schoolers, high schoolers, even a few parents and teachers. The topic was amplifying student voice. Malik stepped up to the mic, not nervous this time. Just focused. "When someone doesn't believe you," he said, "it feels like a door slammed shut in your face. And if it happens enough, you start to wonder if you're even allowed to knock again." He looked out across the rows of students. "But your voice doesn't disappear. It just waits, for someone to listen, for someone to remind you it matters." He introduced Mila and Aisha, who each spoke about what it felt like to stand up for yourself, or someone else, even when it's uncomfortable. When they finished, the room didn't just clap. Some people stood. Some students wiped away tears. Back at school, something strange began to happen. Kids who had never spoken up before started raising their hands in class. One boy in Malik's grade began submitting poems to the school newspaper. A 4th grade girl started a petition to get more diverse books in the library. Mr. Denton watched it all quietly. He didn't take credit. But one afternoon, while Malik was organizing chairs for the next Voyagers meeting, Mr. Denton stopped by. "You've built something," he said. "Something that's actually changing the way this place feels." Malik looked up. "We built it." Mr. Denton nodded. "Still. You started it. I want you to know, I've been listening." Malik considered that. "I know," he said. "That's the best part." The final weeks of the school year moved quickly. Testing, field trips, yearbook signing. But Voyagers kept meeting. Malik kept drawing. Terence kept checking in, always asking the same question: "Are you still speaking your truth?" And Malik always answered the same way, every day. On the last day of school, Ms. Rayner handed Malik a folder before he left. Inside was a letter from the school board. They were partnering with local STEM nonprofits to fund a student-led summer workshop, and they wanted Malik to design the curriculum. The name of the program? Voyagers, Building Truth into the Future. Malik blinked at the paper, then looked up at his dad across the parking lot. "We're not done," he said. Terence smiled. "You were never meant to be." They drove home in silence, the kind that says everything. The desert sky stretched wide above them, golden and infinite. At home, Malik pinned a workshop letter next to his drawing of the Truth Voyager. Then he reached for a fresh notebook, opened it to a clean page, and wrote in all caps. Truth doesn't need permission. It just needs a door that stays open. And that summer, Malik Johnson became that door, for every kid who needed to be heard. The summer sun over Chandler baked everything in sight, cars, sidewalks, even the air itself. But inside the community center on Sycamore Street, something else was heating up, a classroom full of wide-eyed kids learning how to make their voices heard. Malik Johnson stood at the front of the room, a clipboard in one hand, a whiteboard marker in the other. Behind him, the words, "Voyagers, building truth into the future," were written in bold blue letters. The workshop was officially underway. Kids from all over the district had signed up, some shy, some talkative, some dragged in by their older siblings. Ages ranged from 2nd grade to 8th. At first, many of them didn't know what to expect. They thought maybe they'd be building rockets or learning how to code. But what they got was something deeper, a space to speak, listen, and grow. And Malik, just 10 years old, was their guide. Each morning began with a simple prompt on the board: what's one truth you wish more people believed? The answers ranged from funny to heartbreaking. That girls are just as smart as boys. That you don't have to look a certain way to be a leader. That being quiet doesn't mean you have nothing to say. Malik listened. He responded with stories of his own, about Mr. Denton's laugh, about tearing up his drawing, about what it felt like when no one believed him. And he never told those stories to impress. He told them to connect. The heart of the program wasn't technology or textbooks. It was trust. Mila helped run the workshop too, organizing supplies, creating journals for each student, and printing T-shirts with the Voyagers logo. Aisha, now a 6th grader, led the robotics and design sessions in the afternoons. Even Terrence volunteered, teaching 2 sessions on communication systems and answering 100 eager questions about NASA. "Is it true you built space phones?" one boy asked. "Kind of," Terrence replied. "I help make sure they don't drop the call." Laughter rippled through the room. Every Friday, the workshop closed with a truth circle. Students sat in a large ring on the floor, sharing something they learned that week, not just facts, but feelings. I learned it's okay to say you're scared. I learned that when someone says I don't belong, I can still show up. I learned that truth doesn't always get applause, but it still matters. Malik wrote each of those quotes on sticky notes and placed them in a growing mosaic on the wall of the center. He called it the Wall of Truth. By week 3, the mosaic had more than 200 notes. And then, something unexpected happened. The district superintendent, Dr. Renee Wallace, visited the workshop unannounced. A tall woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes, she watched quietly from the back of the room as students presented their voice-inspired projects, collages, short films, journals, even model spacecrafts designed with communication systems inspired by Malik's original Truth Voyager blueprint. At the end of the session, Dr. Wallace pulled Malik aside. "I've been hearing a lot about you," she said. "Your story, this program, it's creating real change." Malik looked down. "I'm just trying to help other kids believe in themselves." She smiled. "Would you be willing to tell your story again? This time, in front of the State Board of Education?" Malik blinked. "Me? Why me?" "Because truth is more powerful when it comes from the people who lived it." That night, Malik sat in his room, looking at the old drawing of his dad holding the Earth and a satellite. He remembered how small he'd felt the day Mr. Denton laughed. How quiet. How invisible. And now, here he was. Leading a workshop. Teaching others. Speaking truth to power. He didn't answer right away. But he knew what he'd say. 2 weeks later, Malik stood in a crisp navy shirt and khakis before a row of seated board members at the state capitol. He wasn't given a speech to read. He brought his own. "My name is Malik Johnson," he began. "I'm 10 years old, and last year, someone laughed at me when I told the truth." He told them everything. The classroom. The dismissal. The silence. Then the moment his father walked in with the badge that changed the room, and the way he saw himself. "But this story isn't about making someone feel bad," he said. "It's about what happens when someone believes in you. My friend Mila did. My dad did. And now I do too." He paused. "That belief. It gave me the courage to speak. And when kids believe their voices matter, they grow up to do big things, maybe even design spacecraft, like I plan to." The room erupted in applause. Afterward, one board member, an older gentleman in a pinstripe suit, approached him. "I'm sorry for what you went through," he said. "But thank you for not giving up." Malik didn't smile out of pride. He smiled out of understanding. Back in Chandler, as summer drew to a close, the community center hosted an open house for parents and students to showcase what they'd learned. The Wall of Truth was now framed and laminated, preserved like a museum piece. Each student stood beside their work, explaining their design or idea. Malik stood in front of a model called Truth Voyager 2. It was sleeker than the first design, complete with small compartments that symbolized stories, voices, lived experiences. One compartment read, "For the kid who's told he's not believable." Terrence stood beside him, beaming. "You've built more than a spacecraft, you know," he said. Malik looked at the families walking through the exhibit, the younger kids pointing at models, the parents nodding, listening, learning. "I think we're all building something," Malik said. "I just drew the blueprint." On the last day of the program, Malik sat alone in the now empty classroom. The tables were cleared, the supplies boxed up. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a new notebook. He flipped to the first page and wrote, "This isn't the end. It's the launch pad." Then he closed the book, stood up, and walked out into the light, ready for whatever mission came next. The first day of 5th grade at Prescott Elementary felt both familiar and brand new. Malik Johnson walked through the school's front doors wearing a clean polo shirt, his backpack freshly organized, and his old drawing of the Truth Voyager safely tucked in the side pocket. The building smelled the same, waxed floors, warm paper, and cafeteria cinnamon rolls, but the way people looked at him had changed. He wasn't the NASA kid anymore, or the boy Mr. Denton laughed at. He was something different now. He was Malik. The one who spoke up. By now, even students who had never shared a class with him knew his name. Over the summer, his photo had appeared in district newsletters and local community bulletins, always under the headline, "Student Voice Leads the Way." Parents shook his hand at open houses. Teachers asked for copies of his Voyager's workshop curriculum. And most of all, other kids started coming to him, not for attention, but for help. "I want to start something like Voyagers at my school," one girl said. "Can you help me write a speech for the student council?" a boy in 4th grade asked. Malik never said no. But what surprised him most when he walked into his new 5th grade classroom was the man standing at the front of the room, Mr. Denton. He was different too.